Great. So, Jeremy, you kind of have had me ask this question in a way at you before, so apologies for a little bit of a repeat. But both you and Tom talked about progressive enhancement, right? Now, is it possible that some of the disagreements about progressive enhancement come down to a sort of semantic fiddliness about, A, what we're talking about, and are we at a point where progressive enhancement is not so much a specific thing or one of the ways, but we're actually talking about the way that we go about working to make things for the web?
It's just words. Progressive enhancement, right? It's just a phrase, and if you don't like the phrase, that's fine. It's more important that you're building something that works in as wide a variety of places as possible, and also provides the best experience possible for the best devices, best user agents. But if you don't like the term progressive enhancement, that's absolutely fine. And yes, after we were talking at EdgeConf, I realized that a lot of people really have an issue with this term progressive enhancement, partly because I think they had these misunderstandings about what it means and what it doesn't mean. And at first I was railing against it. I was like, oh, I need to re-educate people and explain what progressive enhancement means. And then I realized I don't want to be that guy. Like, I heard this podcast episode about this guy on Wikipedia who's made it his life's work to correct every instance of comprises of, because technically that's wrong. It's comprises or consists of. Right? And he's right. He's right, but he's now spending his entire life correcting people. Like, do I want to be that guy, or do I just go, I'll let it go? And so I'm going to let it go.
So I heard Marcy make mention of it. I heard all three of you kind of make mention of it. But one of the touchstones in all three of your talks, or at least references to this, is about constructing things using semantic pieces of the web, semantic HTML, semantic elements. I heard Marcy, you specifically said that there were some arguments against using semantic HTML elements. And I was just wondering if you could kind of say what some of those arguments are and where they come from.
Yeah, so the conversation this week was amongst the React team, and they basically are questioning whether accessibility could be done better using ARIA and custom JavaScript in a component library. So they weren't saying that normal web developers should toss semantic HTML out the window. They were questioning whether higher level components could be made more accessible with this serious attention paid to custom events and things. And the entire accessibility industry was like, what?
Right, because
where did this come from? It seemed crazy. And it's because semantic HTML has such better support in assistive technologies and browsers that to throw all of that progress out the window seems counterproductive. So the burden is on them to prove whether that is a good idea or not.
Right, so when you use semantic HTML, you get some of the things that are ecosystem-wide for free without having to take any real action yourself in some cases to get some of the accessibility benefits. Some things you just get right out of the box by using a list, or using something like that. So Tom, if we're talking about some of the frameworks taking a different approach to this, does that mean that the architects of frameworks have this onus now to somehow apply accessibility or other things into those frameworks to make them have the same level of support?
It's funny, Marcy and I were kind of talking about this last night at dinner, and I think it's interesting. There's oftentimes this dichotomy. For people who are app developers have to think about what is it like on the ground right now and how do I deliver accessible apps right now. But people who are working on frameworks and libraries or on standards bodies are thinking like 2 to 5 years down the road. And so they'll speak in terms of, well, imagine the perfect world in 5 years. And I think in terms of a framework author, we want to do as much as we can to make sure, and this goes back to my talk a little bit about defaults. The more accessible we can make the framework by default, I think the better experience end users will have, because it's a very high leverage thing to do.
Yeah, I think that kind of, just to piggyback on that, part of the problem with ditching semantic HTML is that then you're relying on JavaScript to add all of the accessibility information. Use events, to make a div more accessible, basically. You're relying on a lot more JavaScript to make that happen, and then your default is not the semantic button anymore. So what you get out of that, I think you lose too much, but we'll see, to their point, web standards are really challenging to make progress. We've seen talk this last week about the main element and what's going on with that. And so, to their point, web standards are sometimes holding up progress, and 5 years from now, who knows what we'll have discovered by then.
So I want to start looking for questions from the audience, and while I do that, I'll just kind of riff on what you were saying, Marcy. So, and also, Tom, you made a mention of this too. There's this kind of notion all the time when we're building for the web that there's all this great stuff that's going to land in like a year or two. For example, Service Worker, which is a really exciting technology, but doesn't exist in full anywhere.
Hold on, I have something to say about this.
Hold up.
I think a lot of people, especially people who have been around for a very long time, who like lived through the bad IE days, have really internalized this idea that, standards bodies, yeah, it's great, but when am I going to get to use that feature in like 5 years? The thing that shifted, the thing that's huge, is that now we have what friends at the browser vendors call an evergreen browser. And the idea of an evergreen browser is just one that updates itself without prompting the user. So if you've internalized the pace of the web as what it was like when you only got browser updates every time someone updated their Windows version, then yeah, you're going to think the pace is very slow. But reconsider what the pace of progress is like when every browser updates itself, including on mobile.
And if you're holding on to those browsers that are not evergreen browsers.
But even browsers that update themselves, it does take a while for things to land. I actually agree with you. I think the pace of web API change is amazingly faster than it used to be. But coming back to Service Worker as an example, what if it's great for us to sit and look each other and smile and say, great, let's do this offline first thing, yay, Service Worker, but how do we actually do that today? And some of these questions become part of the thinking when you're doing progressive enhancement and trying to be future friendly, right? Yep. So do we have any questions out in the audience? Oh, come on, folks. Oh, in the middle.
Hi. So I wanted to talk about IE8, and
Do you really?
You're that guy.
So I was having a conversation with some developers that I work with, and we were seeing some stuff that kind of looks like Microsoft is going to sort of phase out support for that and other things. I'd like to hear from the panel, like how what you think about that, when we'll have to start worrying about IE8 and that kind of thing.
I could take that. I support IE8. I support IE7, actually. I support IE6, IE5. I support Netscape Navigator 4. What I don't do is optimize for them. Brad puts it really well, and he says that there's a big difference between support and optimization. So to give you an example, IE8 doesn't support media queries, right? And let's say we're doing a responsive site, and we've got our base styles, and then we've got all our layout styles inside media queries. Like, oh, shit, IE8's not going to get those layout styles. OK, what do we do for IE8? We do nothing. Because the core functionality, whether that's shopping or sharing some social media or reading something on a screen, that's still available to IE8. Now, it might not look very good. It's certainly not going to look as good as it looks in the latest Chrome 70 jillion or whatever the latest version is. That's absolutely OK, right? The websites do not need to look the same in every browser. That's a really core fundamental premise. Now, you might be thinking, that's fine, but my boss insists that it looks the same in IE8, or my client insists it looks the same in IE8. Well, what you want to do is solve the real problem. You might spend your time making it look the same in IE8 as does in Chrome 70 jillion, but you're solving the wrong problem, because the real problem is that your boss thinks it needs to look the same, and the real problem is that your client thinks it needs to look the same. The bad news is that making something look good in an old browser, it's rough, but it's doable because it's technology, whereas changing somebody's mind about websites not needing to look the same in every browser is really hard because they're humans, and humans are really tricky. But you would be solving the correct problem.
The animated GIF of throwing bundles of money directly into the fire comes to mind. Yeah. If they want to spend that much money,
I would say
realistic about it.
From a JavaScript framework perspective, we've discontinued support for IE8 in Ember 2.0. However, to Jeremy's point about the basic technology being the safety net, our thinking is that fast boot is the fallback experience. So even if the JavaScript loads but it doesn't work, hey, at least you got the HTML and the content through fast boot.
And yeah, I just want to say that I'm really pleased with that. It's not just Ember, but it feels like a bunch of frameworks are moving that way. This idea of, well, we'll have this, baseline support where it's server rendered, yeah. And then we don't have to worry about things like IE8 or the old browsers. We got it covered, and then we can spend our time dealing with the faster, newer browsers. And I'm really, really pleased to see that shift happening.
Should we sing Kumbaya now, or?
I want to take another question from the audience in a moment. I do actually have my own question just to follow up on something that Tom was talking about in his talk, which is the notion of connectivity being the only constraint or the constraint. I want to just hear from Marcy and Jeremy about whether they think that this is an accurate thing or that there are other really core constraints that we're facing on the web right now.
Well, I think other constraints do still exist, but like Tom was saying, the rate of change of those constraints is definitely shortened.
Could the rate of change of constraints in itself be a constraint?
Sort of that you can't, yeah. Yeah, between like when you looked up, can I use 5 minutes ago, things have actually changed, yeah. But what I mean, like the classic William Gibson quote, right? The future's already here, it's just not evenly distributed. That certainly applies to browser features and browser APIs. And they will never be completely evenly distributed. It'll always be a little lumpy, although the rate of change has changed. But I agree with Tom, the connectivity, I think, was the big one. And listening to Sophie's talk today, especially, and that idea that if it works in Africa, it'll work anywhere. Connectivity, again, would be the big deal there. Performance, connectivity, those are quite rightly, I think, in the forefront of most people's minds right now.
And connected in a way, right? Performance, connectivity, they have...
Yeah, they're very connected, yeah.
Any other thoughts on that, Marcy?
Yeah, well, assistive technology comes to mind. I mean, the support in screen readers is not standardized, and sometimes, this whole conversation about throwing semantics out the window, the reason why we all cringe so much is because support kind of trickles with assistive technology. And so to just say, we're only going to support ARIA on divs is scary to a lot of people because, yes, we have this browser support that's speeding up, and some assistive technologies are faster to update than others, but there's still this layering effect of required support that gets challenging.
On that topic as well, I think that one of the issues is that because of assistive technology isn't as visible as the latest CSS techniques or the latest JavaScript frameworks, it tends to get dropped off. Like Edge, right? It's out and it's got great support for this CSS and that JavaScript, but when it comes to the accessibility hooks, pretty bad because that's not what gets voted up on user voice, right?
Anyone else in the audience? In the last few minutes, I think we have time for a couple more questions.
My question is for Marcy. What is the downside of the reader view button?
The downside is that you are giving all of design control to the device. I mean, if you spend all this time and resources making things work pixel perfect and then the user just chucks it out the window, I think your time has been spent maybe in the wrong way. I think you just have less control. That seems like the downside. But for the user, I mean, they're empowered to read a simpler experience, and maybe that's better.
Right. But what you said earlier, though, maybe if you made the experience simpler in the first place, people wouldn't need to click that button, I guess is a pretty valid point.
Can you repeat that? It was a little
it wasn't
quiet.
a question. It was more that I'm agreeing with you. That if you take off the clutter and simplify the experience, then the person doesn't feel the need to click that reader view button.
Exactly, yeah. So I talked a little bit about crafting your source order, knowing what comes first for a screen reader when they start swiping from the top. That once they start going through the experience with VoiceOver on a mobile device, they might give up before they even get to your content because you're forcing them through the entire menu, maybe. So to get to the article, it might be one button tap to get to actual content instead of forcing somebody through a closed menu because we didn't properly hide everything.
All right, one more question.
Hi, another question for Marcy. I'm a proponent of designing and developing accessible sites, but it's expensive and it relies on a certain skill set, and clients generally have no idea that that's even an option. Do you have any advice for convincing a client to support and pay for an accessible site?
Sure. I mean, there's always the legal risk, depending on what kind of a client they are. Unfortunately, in accessibility, that's a really good motivator. There's been some things written just in the last week about, let's just sue everyone because that's what works, and it does. But it's true. We sort of have to admit that is true. But I like to approach it from a more positive, exciting angle and look at it in terms of easy wins. If you, as a designer or developer, can highlight easy wins that you could say, hey, we made this thing a little more accessible, it sort of becomes this, like, I don't know, it starts picking up speed. And if you can actually identify things that won't take a lot of your time, and then you can say, hey, we made your app accessible, I mean, maybe that's a way to win over the client, and you haven't had to add incredibly to your scope. So using tools like the Chrome Accessibility Developer Tools, or Axe, or Tenon, tools that you can actually highlight problems for accessibility and then fix them in a short amount of time. I think it takes a little bit of dedication from each of us to highlight those problems. But if you really care about making the web more accessible, I just find I have energy for that, and I will stay late to do it.
Can I just jump in there and say another technique is to not tell them, just do it.
Yeah, exactly.
It's easier to ask for forgiveness than permission.
You do it, don't add a lot to your scope, and then say, hey, guess what? We made this more accessible. And then they go, oh, it was that easy. And then maybe there are bigger ticket items that you have to work into your schedule. If you've showed them that you've had success, then they have more of a reason to put more resources behind that.
Can I add one thing? Or
Okay, yeah.
Sorry.
One last thing.
One last thing I want to say about accessibility, because I was in this boat too, where, like, for me, I'm like a pretty abled person. I don't have trouble using the web. The thing that really drove it home for me was someone just giving me an example, like giving a demo, because it's so easy in my head to rationalize, it probably works fine enough, but then someone actually shows you it in VoiceOver, and it's like, wow, that is awful. So just giving people a demo so that they can empathize with differently abled users, I think is super important if you care about it.
All right. I want to make another thank you round to Jeremy and Marcy and Tom. Thanks so much.